made real and fabricated. So that is basically how the box and the cones came about. But the blanket was a reversal of what I had been doing, which was doing conventional paintings on masonite and then attaching objects.
Right.
And in this case, I was actually using the object as the painted surface, so it functioned both as a picture plane and as the thing that it is, so we recognize it.
Was that kind of a, I mean, how did that idea come to you out of, you know, just as a result of the move or something specific?
No, and I wouldn't say that most of my ideas don't come directly. You know, they come in a roundabout sort of way where
do you make notes? Do you make sketches ever?
I make a lot of sketches. I make a lot of notes. I collect a lot of things. Always just collecting information and images and ideas that I can draw upon. And so that's maybe one way that some of those connections that create that ambiguity get generated. So I also, as I think I mentioned to you at one point, had a memory of my father was in the military briefly, and it didn't ever figure at all in his life much or our family history, except we had all this stuff around that we used if we went on vacation. We had these blankets, army blankets, and if you got a cold, the cure was Vicks Vapor Rub on your neck, but tied around with an army sock for whatever reason, things like that. So there was never any real attachment to the real military aspect. There was just all these things floating around the house all the time, but I was always very attached to those blankets. And then later, I had horses for a long time, and I think which is also where a lot of my interest in the materiality of experience and the materiality of the work comes from. And the blankets, I think, tied into that just in terms of their material and their feel. So it was that physicality.
The tactility.
The tactility, and also the way that it's a big flat thing at the same time, so it could have that dual role.
Now, as you've talked with me about this particular, you know, you yourself have observed several layers of duality within it. You want to describe some of those for us?
Well, it might be useful to start with how the piece got resolved. And I had knew I wanted to work with the blankets and to kind of continue with those non-objective motifs that you saw in the last piece that might be suggestive of a variety of things. And again, then they're kind of placeholders in the picture plane, but they're also lozenge shapes, which could be mouths or wounds or I don't know what else, but things like that. And they're painted in colors that have some relationship to the body, to skin, in the interior of the body, so that they have a somewhat visceral nature to them in terms of how the paint is adhered to the surface and their color. So that was like the first stage, and then the actual draping configuration was the second stage, and the cones were the third, and the box was the fourth. And with the cones in the box, I came to a realization with the piece that I wanted it to be what I would call a dumb object. That is, an object that doesn't pronounce to you what it is or what it's for, and that it really is both ambivalent and ambiguous in terms of how it presents itself. And I can't tell you, because I don't know exactly why I envisioned the box, but it just kind of came to me looking at that piece that it needed some kind of ventilation system that, or cage form that went with it.
Maybe to cool off from the heat of the blanket.
Maybe to cool off from the heat of the blanket, if you want to make that connection. But after I had made several of these box forms, Buzz Spector, I think it was, told me that or a friend of his told me that they reminded him of the insect cages at the Amsterdam Zoo, which I had never seen. And maybe on your next trip you can look those up for me, because I was really intrigued by that new correlation that I hadn't known about. And that kind of possibility in terms of something not being being identifiable by any one specific name, I think.
Somehow it looks like we know it, but we don't know it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at what happens next. Now this one, of course, comes more out of the box at the bottom. So I haven't heard you talk about this one. The title, Carrier, obviously you think of pet carriers or something.
Yeah, and you can, I don't know why you would do this actually, but technically you could actually pick it up and carry it around if you wanted to by the handles. And I think it's
now, just in terms of do you build everything yourself, or do you have things fabricated?
No, I always have those things fabricated. I don't have the skills and the patience to make something that, what I wanted, and I should have said this about the other pieces, well, what I really wanted and continue to want sometimes is to have something fabricated that looks like it was fabricated for a purpose, but that purpose is not available exactly in the work. So I
wanted... It's like an internal contradiction.
And to really be at a level of craft that seems as if they were manufactured.
Well, you know, when you talk about it in that sense, it makes me think of de Chirico's Metaphysical Landscapes, where he had these objects that never made sense in terms of how they were positioned. They look,
I like
they kind of look like they're supposed to do something, but they make no sense. There's no logic to it.
And I think that's how I got to these objects, was through that kind of, those kinds of images, both historically, like with artists like de Chirico, and then in my previous work as well.
Great. Should we move to the next one?
Yeah, just whenever you're ready.
Okay, so you were kind of, you were starting some other series during this period. We're going to go back and forth, but I wanted to keep it chronological.
Well, one of the things that's just basically pretty typical about my work, I think, until we get to my current work of the last 5 years or so, is that I make a lot of pieces that have relationships to each other but don't look exactly like each other. So the blanket pieces and the freestanding wood and steel sculptures, and these, I only did 2 heterotaxia pieces. Those 2 pieces were all part of a larger project called Appetite for System. And that title came from some research that I was doing into the development of the modern day asylum in the 19th century. And I was interested in that because I'm interested in the irrational and our definitions of rationality and irrationality. And I'm also interested in how things work and when they don't work or break down, whether it's the bread mold or molding bread rather, or the human body or the human psyche. And so all of these pieces that exist within that larger structure of the Appetite for System project. And this piece, as well as its companion piece of a similar name, I think probably most prefigure what I'm doing now with the introduction of the plywood, in which I picked out certain forms or shapes in the wood and painted them.
Now, is the cotton fabric, was that a pattern already there, or did you paint it?
Yes and no. It was a mix. It's a mix.
Okay.
And the forms, I'm interested in, and still am, in strategies of reproduction and excessiveness, doing more to a material or more to a piece than is logical to do. So in these pieces, I was also thinking about tactics of display. So the elements are the plywood that I just described, but also the fabric is pre-existing upholstery fabric in which the individual floral motifs were painted out or veiled. You can still see them, but they were veiled, and then some of them were repainted in a much less decorative and more realistic fashion. And then the jar, again, contains a cone of molding bread, and then the attachment is a shooting mat that I found at like a military surplus, just for where you're on a target range, you'd lay down on your stomach and shoot your gun, which is not something I was familiar with.
And the element that's at the bottom, what is that?
That's the shooting mat I was talking about.
That's the shooting mat, okay.
And I don't think I was as much attracted to its purpose as I was to its form, and the buckles and straps and the materials, and that element of functionality in the piece.
Again, heterotaxia it's a real word?
It's a real word. It's a word that denotes when things are, I should have memorized the definition for tonight because I haven't said it in a long time, but it's when things are out of their natural order, such as geologic strata or the organs of the human body are switched or are out of place. So it's things that are structures that are reordered.
Okay. In terms of the relationship of this sort of, you're dealing with irrationality, you're dealing with things sort of out of order. How does this relate to, say, the larger world at the time you're doing this? Is there any connection to, your feelings about the world at large, or is this just totally a conceptual thing?
Oh, well, I think even conceptual things tie into the
how?
world at large. I think there's probably a number of dimensions to that, to my answer, and One certainly has to do with maybe certain political events at a given time. I mean, this is after the first Gulf War, and some of the kind of response to rationality that the Surrealists and the Dadaists had were certainly in my mind. But I think more importantly, I'm really interested in the way that experience can elude fixation in language or in vision. Like, how do we derive meaning from what we see?
Perception, in other words.
Yes. And how perception can be triggered, altered, enhanced by these kinds of juxtapositions and references, so that you have a lot of kind of floating associations that hook up with each other in different ways during the experiencing of the work. So I think, and that operation in the work, I think, then correlates to the ways that we might view and understand or not understand things that don't line up in our minds in a rational way.
Well, it's interesting that earlier you used the term emblematic, you know, and I mean, it's very true. Certainly since the 1980s, maybe even earlier in our culture, we are so conditioned to seeing things as visual, like sound bites, but visual bites of information. It's now computer icons, you know, but it's we see little fragments of this and fragments of that, but somehow each fragment represents, you know, a gazillion layers of meaning, and not all the same to each one. So as the more I look at this, I see that you're organizing the different elements of your overall composition that way, almost like moving computer icons around on your desktop, and each one is somehow, you know, a different meaning, and they all add up to an amalgam of something. But what that something is, again, is going to vary, you know, hugely, I think, from one person to the next.
I think absolutely, and I really don't think I'm trying to create meaning as much as call our attention to the way that meaning is made, and then to create experience. And I do think you asked if it correlated to anything that was going on in the larger world, and one thing that it does correlate to both then and now is that I feel like the way we understand the world is becoming very literalized, and those gazillion meanings that you refer to, I think, are not always grasped because of the speed at which we're given that information and the kind of superficiality or truncated nature of that information. And that I really do want to kind of speak up for the possibility of things not being able to be fixed verbally or logically explained. And at the same time, I'm absolutely fascinated by all of our attempts to understand and to know by all sorts of scientific.
Do you ever think about just the poetic level of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because we don't want to forget that's what artists do. They make poetry.
Well, exactly, and I think we do forget that in the larger culture, or maybe that in the larger culture, it's not even understood anymore that that's what artists can do.
Exactly. And so it makes it art.
Yeah. I think so.
Okay. Here's another sort of hybrid or variation of what we've been looking at, Crybaby. Why are you calling this one Crybaby?
Oh, because I was thinking of that box as a kind of speaker. This form looked like a speaker, and I was thinking if it made a sound, you know, would it be a wailing, annoying sound?
So it's almost like a giant face, huh?
No.
No.
Because I don't do faces. But I was thinking of it as a sound device that didn't make sound.
Okay. Okay. Enveloped by a banner of sorts, then.
And again, I think a lot of the impulses are very much like the impulses in the piece that the museum has that I talked about. The straps are, again, implied functionality without any real function. For me, going back to my experience with horses and horse blankets. And it's a military blanket, and then the motifs on there are, again, painted like the lozenges on the Sama piece with metal grommets piercing their centers.
Well, and also it seems so that, you know, its identity is less as blanket now, more as sculpture, you know, than in the earlier version.
Yeah. I don't think I thought about that consciously, but absolutely.
Okay. Again, I think back to what we talked about with De Chirico and surrealism when I look at this one, certainly, with the contradiction, slipper chair, you call it. Now, this is very different in some respects, though, from the others, although it's kind of like a counterpart to the carrier piece in a way.
It is. It's definitely a counterpart, and this is still part of that project where I was creating a lot of different kinds of objects that had some functionality or implied functionality. But I can't really speak in a very articulate historical way about surrealism tonight. I'm not prepared to do that. But it is a kind of attraction that I have, and it's not been always a very popular attraction. But it's something that I've always kind of gravitated to, and I think because of its formalization of psychological information in a visual way.
Well, it's that very sort of blatant, deliberate contradiction, a la Magritte, you know, an image of a pipe that says this is not a pipe underneath it. So you see one thing, but you see the contradiction of it at the same time.
Exactly.
And then when I was referring to the counterpart, obviously you've got the hard geometric manufactured box and the very soft organic kind of material of this. And again, you know, I keep saying recurring both in your material and some of your depicted imagery is this love of drapery that you talked about that goes way back.
Yeah. And these pieces, although they are shown independently, they have primarily been shown in kind of installation form, so that those reverberations among the pieces.
They dialogue with one another.
Exactly. And we were talking about associations and triggering associations earlier, and this piece, as well as a companion piece, which is a chaise longue that has straps on as well, tend to be read automatically as some kind of bondage, but in actuality they're, those are the kind of responses, but these are self-imposed, like seat belts. You know, they talk about safety and desires for safety, or self-containment.
And then also someone, you know, obviously it would be uncomfortable to sit on.
Yeah, I was not the one who first identified it as a slipper chair. I'd never heard that term. And so a friend of mine who deals with antiques and collectibles and stuff told me that that's what it was, and you can still buy them, that they're a vanity chair that's at a lower height so that a woman can reach down and put her slippers on.
Okay.
But there's a great story about this chair that you